Good day, everyone. Welcome to another insightful episode on at FEB UGM Research Series Program from the PLAM. I'm your host, Wisnu Nugroho, and today we have a distinguished speaker coming far away from United States that join us for shedding some lights about political landscape and political and economic landscape in Indonesia. We have privilege with Professor Matthew Winters coming here. He's a renowned professor in political science from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Before we start our discussion, before we start our questions, I will briefly introduce about Professor Matthew Winters. He's esteemed academicians and researchers. His expertise lies between politics, economics, and particularly in political development, foreign aid, and corruption in developing countries. Without any delay, maybe we can just discuss the current issue, which is the political economy of accountability. So let's extending our warm welcome to Professor Matthew. Thank you for joining us today. How are you, Prof Matthew?
I'm well. Pak Wisnu, thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you so much. Maybe we can just start the first questions. Your expertise in accountability, right? And then in short course, you discuss a lot about public accountability. So my question is government need some certain of accountability for sure. But then we also know that the private sector also has a need to be accountability, especially environmental issue, maybe a social issue. So what's the definition? Where's the difference between the definition of public accountability and then the private accountability? So from your perspective.
Yeah, so I'm fond of a very broad definition of accountability that I think we can use in either public or private settings. And so accountability is where there's an actor that we want to hold accountable, and there's a forum, a group of people that can ask things of that actor and can demand explanations and justifications for the actor's behavior. And then there's a possibility that if those explanations or justifications are not satisfactory, that the forum might be able to punish the actor in some way. And so when thinking about government and thinking about democratic governance, we think about elections, that elections are an opportunity for citizens to ask elected officials, politicians, why has our country been working this way? Why has the government been doing this? And their answers are either satisfactory, and then the citizens can vote for them to remain in office, or they're unsatisfactory, and then the citizens might vote them out of office. With private companies, private corporations, their primary forum is the ownership, right? And so if it's a public company that's listed on a stock exchange, that would be shareholders, or if it's a privately held company, then that's a very small group of people. And most commonly what that forum is asking of a private corporation is to make money, right?
Exactly.
And hold them accountable for making money or not. And this brings up these issues then of broader public concern, where corporations in their pursuit of profit might create environmental harm or otherwise be engaging in activities that lower social welfare. And so how do people in the mass public hold those private actors accountable? It can be a challenge.
Exactly.
One thing is that corporations, like individual citizens, live under a legal system, a set of regulations and laws, and can be held legally accountable, can be called before a court to explain if their behavior is in violation of a law or not, and they might be punished if it is, assuming that the court system is working as it's supposed to, written on the books. If people want to hold a corporation accountable, then the most likely mechanism is by appealing to the government. And so we can think of a chain of accountability where people try to hold political officials accountable, and one thing for which they may be holding those elected officials accountable is how well are the elected officials regulating business, regulating corporations. And if they don't think they're doing a good job, they can demand more. And if they don't get the outcomes that they like, they can try a different group of elected officials. The other mechanism that the public has is the consumer mechanism, assuming we're talking about a corporation that sells things to the public, a mechanism for accountability then is to stop buying things from that corporation so that the public can do that. But it can be challenging, right, for, say, a natural resource extracting company that's selling mostly to international markets and not directly to the citizens of Indonesia. Then that really requires that people put pressure on the government to do something about that company if it's producing social harms, if it's producing environmental damage, or if it's not respecting labor rights, something else where there's a social welfare cost.
Right. So essentially, like what you're saying is, for public accountability, is like the challenge is more like direct. You can use election, you can like just like punish the current official by not choosing them in the next period. But for like private accountability, is like more like a kind of way around, right? You need like some maybe like representative that like people actually can represent very well, or like maybe usually the market power or something like that. So that's the main difference and the challenge between the public and private accountability. All right, so next to the second question, so you're writing a paper on 2010 on foreign aid involved a chain of accountability relationships stretching from international donor through national government, implementing agency to set a limit and user of goods service financed by the aid. So basically foreign aid, and then like the potential of corruption in foreign aid, right? So in developing countries such as Indonesia, do you think is a reliable way to increase economic growth, the foreign aid? That's my first questions. And then not only economic growth, maybe like skill transfer and the other thing that follow with the foreign aid. And the second question is like between these 13 years, I think, like from your first paper published, like is there any improvement, and what the challenge like ahead, especially for developing country like Indonesia?
Yeah, that's a lot of questions there. So yeah, I've been very interested in accountability relations within foreign aid projects, because foreign aid is sometimes an unusual world where a foreign donor provides money maybe to a non-governmental organization that then is providing services to people. It might be providing healthcare or education, might be helping people build an irrigation system. And what if something goes wrong in that project? As compared to having an elected official and thinking that you can go and complain to the elected official and that you have a clear mechanism for holding that elected official accountable, when you have this chain of delegation in foreign aid, who can average citizens hold accountable? It's often not very clear. I think that is a problem that's maybe somewhat separate from thinking about foreign aid effectiveness. Foreign aid effectiveness is very interesting. We have a paradox in foreign aid. It's called the micro-macro paradox. So at the micro level, if we go and investigate an individual foreign aid project, most likely we'll find evidence that it did some good, that at the minimum, a hospital was built, health clinics were built, or schools were built. And even we're probably likely to find that there are children going to those schools or people getting treated by doctors at the hospital. And so at the micro level, at the individual project level, we can find a lot of foreign aid success stories. We can also find some not so great stories, but on average, we find success stories. But at the macro level, it's been very challenging to find really credible evidence that foreign aid promotes economic growth at the national level, or some people have tried to study it at the regional level. And a possible explanation for that is that even though foreign aid is doing many good things at the micro level, it has unintended consequences at the macro level, some of which have to do with accountability. And so there's a theory of the fiscal contract that people are most ready to hold their government accountable when they're being taxed by their government. Because then what's the government using to do the things that governments do? It's using money that came right out of people's pockets. When there's a lot of foreign aid in a country, or when there's a lot of natural resource wealth in a country, that fiscal contract can be much weaker because people are being taxed less because the government is using these other sources of revenue to do the things that governments do. And that might mean that the people who are most able to monitor the quality of government performance are less incentivized to do so because they're not paying taxes, and that they're less eager to engage in these accountability mechanisms of demanding explanations from the government and maybe voting against incumbent officials. And so in that sense, even while foreign aid is doing good things at the micro level, it might be undermining growth at the macro level. I think the academics who study foreign aid effectiveness are moving towards a consensus that aid actually has been useful at promoting economic growth, even at the macro level. But the effects are pretty small. They've been hard to detect, and it's just a hard thing to study because you need to find countries that have received foreign aid and countries that haven't, that otherwise look similar.
Yes.
But there aren't, every country that receives foreign aid looks like a lot of other countries that also receive foreign aid.
Exactly.
So it's a really challenging problem. In terms of the last part of the question, have we seen change over time? I'm sad to say not that much. And that's because institutions are persistent. And foreign aid institutions are persistent, and the incentives within foreign aid institutions, so for someone who works for a bilateral donor like the US Agency for International Development or the Japanese International Cooperation Agency, or someone who works for a multilateral donor like the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank, their incentives, the things that determine whether they're going to get a salary increase, whether they're going to get a promotion, or whether they've created projects. So whether they've gotten some money out the door. That's the clearest thing that they can show that I'm doing my job as someone who works at a foreign aid agency, is I have created some new projects. They really don't get assessed professionally on the success of those projects. And that's an accountability problem, because then what are they accountable for? They're accountable for moving money out the door rather than for whether or not a given project has done what it promised to do or not.
So like essentially what you're saying is until like even like 13 years from your first paper published, like they're only focusing on the output, which is like disbursement of money rather than the outcome.
Yeah, or even they focus on one very early output and not even on the next round of outputs that might happen.
So basically, like, at the moment output, or like, and then they don't care about the next one is like different day or like different project. Get it. So following up to that issue, like we know that then in the domestically or like in the local government or like maybe like in national government, we have like facing corruption issue, right? Even in the foreign aid situation, like maybe they pick some random vendor that not having credibility, and then just like the project is not working very well in that way. So based on your research, Indonesia has a like trident of eradication of corruption, which is prosecution, prevention, and also education. Like between these three, which one you think like the best effort? Like what are you thinking about these three effort? And then between these three, like what do you think like the best? I know we discussed with Parimawan, like maybe education not so much, but maybe you have like different opinion.
Yeah, I mean I think that prosecution helps with prevention, right? I think that punishing people, showing them that there are consequences for engaging in corruption is an effective anti-corruption strategy. Whereas if people know that there are unlikely to be consequences or that there is a cultural tolerance, then they're not going to be disincentivized from engaging in corruption. With education, I think there are many things on which people can be educated. I'm skeptical of moral education, of just telling people corruption is bad, corruption is bad. Have you learned that corruption is bad? And people will say, yes, I've learned that corruption is bad.
But they're still doing it.
But it doesn't really change their incentives when they're faced with the question of do I pay a bribe or not, or do I ask for a bribe or not, or do I award a contract to a family friend? Other people talk about education in terms of giving citizens the skills to monitor what government is doing. And I think there's some potential there, but I'm also skeptical that it's useful education for the whole population. I think that type of training is useful for NGOs and for activists who decided to dedicate themselves to this, that they're really going to pay attention to what government's doing and check the budget numbers and make sure they add up and look through the request for proposals and see if the procurement bidding was done right. Like, there's a small group of people out there who really care about these issues enough to do that, and giving them as much training as possible to be able to do it makes sense. I don't know if we need to train everybody to be monitoring government, that's maybe something that citizens will delegate. I do think that some anti-corruption effort can be made by teaching people how to report about petty corruption. So if people have been forced to pay a bribe to a police officer or been forced to pay a bribe to enroll their child in school, do they know who to report that to? And maybe equally importantly, do they think other people are going to report? Because people are probably only going to act if they think that other people would do the same thing, and they'll only have comfort if that's the case. And so education can help create that expectation that, in general, me, my neighbors, my friends, if we saw this, if this happened to us, we would report on it. And so in that sense, education can be valuable for sure.
Okay, so it's essentially like building through education, but basically creating a culture that reporting like something not right?
That's right.
Right, so the next question is we know like there's a not debate actually. Most people will say like a corruption, failure of accountability will create a sense of economic growth, right? Not a Greece, like only like few people like thinking it's a Greece, like politicians usually thinking it's like a Greece of economic growth. So we can like most of us can agree this is a sign. It's actually stunted the economic growth. So for case Indonesia, like we don't want like the failure of accountability happen like in MENA region, for example. So people fed up with the government and then like start revolution. So as a researcher like from US, like what do you think like Indonesia had to do to avoid that kind of situations?
Yeah, it's about giving people voice, right? So creating accountability mechanisms that work. And I think that first is about helping people have access to information. And so one problem that we see in many countries around the world is very concentrated media environments. So Bolivia is a case that I know fairly well, a country that I know fairly well. And one of the major opposition newspapers there just closed. Why did it close? Because the government stopped purchasing advertisements in that newspaper, and their revenue went away, and they had no other way of sustaining themselves. Now, I can understand if you're the government, you don't really want to be supporting somebody that's constantly criticizing you. But on the other hand, now that there's no critical voice, people have that much less information about what the government is doing. And so that's a challenge then for governments, right? But I think the key thing is, to not suppress opposition voices, right? To let there be criticism, let there be free and independent media that are reporting on government performance. That will help accountability. That gives citizens one of the things that they need. The other thing that they need that's similar, and again, we can imagine that people in government don't really want to do this, but is to try and make sure there's competition, that accountability in the political world requires being able to replace the current elected official with someone else. And so insofar as there's meaningful accountability, meaningful competition, meaningful choices for voters, for citizens, that's going to help with accountability as well.
All right, so essentially like the idea is like giving people voice, foster the opposition, foster the competition, for make sure like people that actually enroll in the government, now they can like I'm gonna replace by someone if I'm not doing the correct job, right? Something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm realistic. I don't know if the government's really going to foster opposition, but allowing the playing field to be fair, right? Not trying to use positions in power to repress the opposition. The political scientist Adam Pravorsky talks about democracy as a system where people lose elections. That's so key, right? That you don't enter elected office planning to stay there forever, but really being willing to accept that either because you didn't perform well or because the world gave you a exogenous shock that you couldn't deal with, you may lose election and you may need to hand over power to somebody else. And countries around the world need leaders with that mentality in order for democracy to deliver on its promise of things like better economic growth and better service provision to its citizens.
Right, so this is like related to the Foster competitions. Like, we want to know your opinion. I think you talked about this like in the short course as well, in the seminar. The mega coalitions that Indonesia has right now, like a president hold like a lot of party together. Like, do you think it's a good for Indonesian democracy, or like what people should expect for the next? Like, what should kind of candidate like we should pick so this is not happen again, for example?
Yeah, it's a challenging thing to comment on because I do understand that there's a bit of a cultural difference here, right? In a sense of bringing everybody into these grand coalition cabinets that Indonesia has had in the post-reformasi period. But I think they make it challenging for voters to understand the political landscape. That having a system where the former opponent through 2 elections is now a member of the cabinet makes it hard for voters to know, well, is he an opposition figure, or are they allied? And therefore, when trying to make voting decisions in the upcoming election, if they want to vote against the government, if they want to vote against the status quo, they don't think that the last 5 years have been good years, who should they vote for? And so in a system where there's a bit more opposition that remains clear over time, I think that's helpful for voters because then they know who to think of as the alternative, which political parties, which politicians to think of as the alternative. Related to this is, and this happens in many countries as well, but is kind of the issue of party switching or different parties being willing to back different candidates, and that's very elite level politics that I think complicates things for the voters. It denies them the simple narrative of, if I'm happy, I vote this way. If I'm not happy,
the other way.
Vote the other way.
Yep. So it's just like mega coalition may be bad for like everything's easy in the term of policy because nobody really opposes the policy, but then in terms of like accountability in election, it's hard for people now to see like which one actually doing best or which one is not doing best, so we can like kind of punish like in the next election, right? That's what you say.
Though it's also not clear that it's good for policy making, right? In the sense of if you're certain that the policy is going to go through, are you really getting the best policy?
Actually, true. Yes.
You put in the most effort to design a good policy.
Agree. That's actually true. All right. So last questions for Prof Matthew, Pak Matt. Can you give us like suggestions to foster like political accountability, public accountability in Indonesia?
I think the things I've already said about encouraging information flows, about creating meaningful choices for citizens. So I think that the government can do things like that. And, I think a major issue that's happened in the last few years is the politicization of the Anti-Corruption Commission. That there's a sense that it is not as independent as it previously was. And that to me seems problematic, that it was a government entity that had a good reputation, that people could treat as providing meaningful information about the likelihood that somebody was corrupt. And now it seems to have become a bit more politicized, and I think that's probably a loss for the country. So if we can get back to a more independent scenario, I suspect that's a better world to be in.
Okay, so I think what you're saying is KPK, like now it's become less independent than before. Like, so it's like a kind of like backwards than like previous period.
That's my impression, is that yes, there's been a step back with the KPK.
Okay. All right, thank you so much, Pak Matt. I think to conclude, like we definitely need a public accountability because it's like related to economics, to the policy, to the political landscape of Indonesia. I think like we learn from Pak Matt, like there's a bunch of branch that we can foster accountability as well, and then like what people can expect for the future elections. So thank you once again for the insightful talk, and for the watchers, thank you for watching, and see you for another research series. Thank you, Pak Matt.